So congratulations on this fantastic book. It's great to see it live here in person too. And maybe Tarun, I know you've been collecting these interviews from leaders across the global South. So maybe you can just tell us about this video project at HBS and how the book came about.
Geoff Jones and I have collaborated for quite some time, probably over a decade, to produce this video archive that's called the Creating Emerging Markets project at Harvard Business School. Geoff really should get the credit for starting it off. He had been doing some audio interviews for a while, and I joined him because I ended up just doing a lot of the video stuff, starting in India and other South Asian countries quite some time ago. But I think what we're after is trying to make sure that our students, whether they're MBA students, undergraduates, executive financiers, who we're fortunate enough to meet when they come to HBS from around the world, that they're exposed to stories of iconic leaders and entrepreneurs who are not just from New York and London, to caricature, I realize. And we have been fortunate enough to have encountered many of these people in literally 30 or 40 countries around the world in the last few decades at HBS. And it just seemed nice to be able to bring that to the attention of the world and to make it, as HBSs want to do, a public good so that people can tap into it, scholars, other entrepreneurs, interested parties, policymakers, media, can use it as a free resource for teaching and research and communication.
And how did the book idea come about?
Well, I think when you start an infrastructural project like the Creating Emerging Markets project, you realize that it's not sufficient to just create the asset, which is a collection of videos. We have now 150 plus interviews recorded, an hour each, often of people who are genuine celebrities in their home countries. Many times they don't even speak to people. But we're lucky that we're at an institution that's trusted, and so people would speak to us. But you don't just create the asset, you then have to invest in creating the ecosystem around the asset so that people know about it, get the word out, and you have to spend a lot of time making it easy for people to access, and even inventing new pedagogical techniques in some ways so that people know how to bring it into the classroom environment. We're sitting in one of our classrooms and we're used to doing, in the quote-unquote old days, paper and pencil teaching with a chalkboard and writing on the board, and people read the paper case. And now, a lot of information is multimedia. It's sound, it's video, it's in different formats and different cadences. And a lot of what we've been doing in this overall project is not just the actual video shoots of people, but to create the other assets that are needed around it to make it work.
Great, and Geoff, Leadership to Last is out now. So what's the quick synopsis of what is this book about?
It's about the nature of business leadership in India, with a particular focus on the fact that India has seen the creation of businesses which literally last generation after generation, and businesses which have some distinct characteristics as well of responsibility, of an ability to innovate, and an ability to survive in sometimes quite turbulent conditions.
Great, and I know as a business historian, you've come to this project through a certain lens, and there were hundreds of videos. How did you come up with who you decided to focus on in this book? What was the framework you used? How did you make these decisions?
It was tough, but I think we had some clear criterion. In particular, we wanted people who were truly impactful. So we started off looking at people who were obviously impactful, who had led giant businesses, Ratan Tata, Adi Goodrich, and we were fortunate that they agreed to talk to us. Over time, I think we started to think of impact in a more diverse way. So we talked to Shabana Azmi, the actress, who was highly impactful, not as a giant business leader, but in terms of her creativity.
You know, I think what was interesting about what you wrote is that these weren't just get-rich-quick solutions and institutions, but these were solutions and institutions that were built to last. Could you talk about that, Tarun? Elaborate on that a little bit more?
So, you know, we're sitting in a HBS classroom, and frequently we have ideas that are incubated here. We're lucky enough to see them being formed, and they go on to become so-called unicorns. And there's a big fetish in the media out there with, oh, there's a new unicorn, or how many unicorns did each country produce? And those are meant to indicate companies that rapidly reach $1 billion in market cap, or a super unicorn, like 10 billion, and so on. We have nothing against those, but that's not the focus of this book. The focus of this book are on institutions that have changed the fabric of society, regardless of whether the entrepreneur has himself or herself become fabulously wealthy as a result of that change. So we think of impact much more holistically. It should almost change the very nature of society, the fabric of society. And for that, you need time to pass. And so you'll find that virtually all of the entrepreneurs profiled in the book and in the Creating Emerging Markets broader database tend to be towards the end of their careers, when they have time to reflect on the entire arc of their achievements. And that makes them both cognizant of their own achievements, but also their limitations. They're very human limitations. They're human beings like the rest of us, and the manner in which they've changed societies. So we think of impact as lasting and multidimensional.
And is there a special formula of these institutions that emerged, and looking at them all together, what were some of the pieces of them that made them into lasting institutions that had such impact? So
there's no recipe to follow. If there were, we would all be doing it and making these impactful organizations. But there are some general principles we feel that are worth articulating, which is sort of the point of the book. And in the book, we have it thematically divided into things that entrepreneurs do, innovate, market, take care of their employees and so on, pretty standard things in some ways. But the broader theme that emerges is that, particularly in the emerging markets, in the developing countries, which we think of as somewhat institutionally weaker than some of the more Western developed societies currently, the task falls on the entrepreneur to do considerably more than what he or she would have to do if they were sitting in Boston and they had access to all these amazing support services around them. Everything from excellent information to wonderful pots of risk capital to adjudication services to talent assessment to valuation of intangible assets. It's a long list. Now, where I grew up in India, even now as a middle-income country, let alone in many of the other countries in which we do the Creating Emerging Markets projects, many of these services are less developed than you would like. And so a common theme that emerges in all these stories is that the entrepreneur, of course, wants to do what she wants to do, make an amazing film, or run a financial inclusion business, or do heart surgery on people who don't get operated on. But in order to do that, the entrepreneur also has to do 50 other things that normally you would say, well, isn't that the role of the government? And the answer might be, in an ideal world, yes, but then your choices are you either don't do it because the government hasn't gotten around to doing it and isn't likely to do it anytime soon, or you get up and orchestrate a solution to that infrastructural problem also. So I think this ambient sensibility of problem solving needing to be not just about your immediate goal, but to be responsive to societal issues is a general theme that emerges.
Jeff, just to follow up on that, we're talking a bit here about the institutions, but what about the leaders themselves? What stood out to you about the leaders that made them sort of iconic and lasting?
I think many of the ones, or maybe all of the ones we interviewed, were, I think, full of integrity and generous often with a surprising degree of humility, a willingness to acknowledge where things didn't work or where failures had happened. I think strong values shine out of a lot of them when they talked, genuineness.
And in writing this and thinking through the different interviews that you had, I mean, what were some of the challenges you faced in compiling this book and putting together the final product?
So I think the biggest challenge actually was in the logistics of getting these interviews in the first place, right? Not to be underestimated. It's a mechanical task, but think about pulling together hundreds of hours of interviews with intensely private individuals who are rightly careful about their stories and their reputations in infrastructurally compromised locations all over the world. And you understand why it's a task that I think it's the responsibility of an institution like ours to undertake for the greater good in some sense. So I think the mechanics were very difficult to pull off. You'd have to have amazing camera crews in different parts of the world that met some global standards. Very hard to pull off in many places. So things like that, I think, were the bigger problems than actually producing the book itself. I would like to say that it's amazing to me that nobody turned us down. I can't think of a single instance when we approached someone and said, would you agree to be interviewed? And they turned us down. There was one instance that I can remember when someone was very elderly, and that person has since sadly passed on, and didn't agree because of health reasons. The family didn't agree because of health reasons. And of course, logistics may not comply because you had to be physically there and so on. And then COVID made doing interviews almost impossible in the last couple of years. But in actually pulling together, I wouldn't say that the quote-unquote best interviews are in the book and the others are not. It's just you have to kind of put together a collage that fits together. And there may equally well be other collages that fit together equally well. It's just that our limited creativity resulted in this this particular ensemble that's in the book. And we'll let the readers be the judge of it.
You know, I love the diversity that you have in the book, and as you mentioned a bit of it also, nonprofits, you know, some of these major institutions. I love the chapter on women, which is really interesting too. Could you elaborate a bit on this? You know, how did these women and some of the other marginalized groups that you spoke with, you know, maybe rise? What were some of the challenges and barriers they had to overcome, and how did that influence the institutions that they built?
Well, I mean, first of all, it was obvious from the interviews that there were many challenges. Many of the people, it's the first time they'd been employed. A woman had been employed in that kind of position and things. That's not too surprising, but you know, hearing it was impressive, but also hearing how they overcame it. So we heard lots of good stories as well, that it's very tough if you're the first woman, but after that it gets easier. We learned the story about the importance of mentorship, that women really need other women as mentors. But if you can figure out a system, you can put it in place. We learned about the enormous challenges of finding money, capital raising faced by women. But we also heard stories of how ways were found to facilitate that. So in a way, the stories here confirm the challenges worldwide faced by women, and I would say particularly in India in many respects, but we had a lot of learnings about how those challenges can be overcome as well.
How do you think that others can learn from, if you had advice to give to budding entrepreneurs from some of these interviews and some of the challenges that were talked about from these various different leaders, what advice would you give to budding entrepreneurs to think about from these leaders?
I don't think the advice would be unique to the developing countries, the emerging markets. I just think that the degree of, I sometimes think that the upside is higher and the downside is lower of being an entrepreneur in an emerging market. In other words, if you do manage to fix some problem, that's significant. And I'm leaving aside sort of trivial things like a small app that does something cute now, but something that really solves a big problem that millions of people are facing, you stand to be rewarded enormously, both financially and non-financially, correctly so. But you're, I think, much likely to fail. That's been my sense-making of just watching all the people that we've interacted with and trying to learn from them. But one thing that's common is most of these people, I'm not saying that they all started out exactly the same way, but most of these people had a very ambitious goal in mind, and then they approached it in very bite-sized chunks. And in some cases, the ambitious goal emerged over a few years and a decade, sometimes over multiple decades, over a couple of generations of a particular family, sometimes much quicker than that. So if I can think of some examples, Zia Modi, who was this impressive woman, graduate of Harvard Law actually, seemed to be thinking a lot about the role of women in the legal profession, and now runs one of the biggest, most impressive law firms in the country. Kiran Mazumdar is sort of our poster child of innovation in India, self-made biotech billionaire. Started out in the brewing business, doing enzymes, and quickly saw over a 10-year period that, wow, the world is my oyster if I really can crack some other bigger problems. And now is, actively one of the first makers of oral insulin, nasal insulin that'll affect the world, and so on and so forth. There are a number of amazing men and women who basically had a big canvas that they were painting on, even though individual years was more like a brushstroke on a canvas.
And the chapters we've talked about are really interesting, the breakdown. Why did you start with the chapter Managing Families?
Well, family is at the heart of business in almost all the global south, and certainly in India. It's the starting point, and family is really giving the stability that we're looking at. Family is at the core of the way that values are transmitted from one generation to another, rather than just being lost as people retire or die. So I think family is almost the starting point of understanding business in India, and I think it's a great strength of business in India. It has its downsides sometimes, but it also has enormous strengths, I believe.
So it relates to the previous comment, right, that if you don't have, for instance, social insurance in the country, in as robust a form as you might have here. I mean, look at what's happened with COVID. The governments in the rich countries have flooded us with grants of all sorts and unemployment compensation and so on, correctly, because we're able to. We have the mechanisms to do it in this country. But if you don't have all that, then entrepreneurship is a rough and tumble business, right? I mean, most of the time, it's also very lonely. So you need, in the absence of, call it, insurance mechanisms, you need financial stability as an individual entrepreneur, which the family can provide, broader family to some extent. And you need psychological crutches, not just financial crutches, psychological crutches. And again, you need to be part of some embedded structure. And I think the family is usually that embedded structure. Comes with a lot of warts, as we all know. But the key to these people is that they took the good with the bad and tried to accentuate the good and limit the bad at the family side. And a lot of the chapters, a lot of the stories in the family chapter are very explicit about some tough things that had to be done within the family, intergenerationally, and within each generation to make sure that the good outweighed the bad.
You have such a wonderful collection here. What do you think makes this book different?
Well, a number of things make Leadership to Last different. First of all, it's businesses that have lasted generations in some instances. That's the focus of the book, so therefore that's the defining characteristic of what's different about these. I think we define success in very many multifaceted ways. If you want to reshape society, the only way to do it is not necessarily just by making a new widget that you sell. It's also thinking about how to organize society in different ways. And at Harvard Business School, we like to say we educate leaders who make a difference in the world. We don't say we educate leaders who only make a buck in the world. And the choice of those words is intentional. And we're trying to live that choice in profiling people that we admire and we've learned a lot from.
I think a conventional book could have organized its chapters in another different way. Could have been a chapter on strategy, a chapter on raising finance, a chapter on organization, for example. And we chose a different road. We chose to focus on problems, and problems that we think are extremely important: inclusion, gender, equity, and so on. So I think that's also a very distinctive feature of our book.
What was your favorite part of creating this book?
We'd spent so long collecting these interviews to actually use them and see a product emerging and stories emerging, I think was a very fulfilling process, at least for me.
I think for me, it's doing the interviews. It's just endless fun to be with accomplished people and have a one-on-one conversation for an hour, hour and a half, 2 hours. That's focused on, it's like a master class delivered to an audience of one, the interviewer. So, we've had almost 25 senior faculty at Harvard participate in pulling together the interviews from these different countries. And I think they would all say they really enjoyed the actual interview process. I mean, how could you not? These are extraordinary people who have done extraordinary things and have the humility to tell you exactly what happened. Of course, with the benefit of hindsight, looking back on the arc of their career. So that's the most enjoyable thing for me, anyway. And I'm looking forward to continuing to do this because this is a living project. So.
And how did you come together as co-authors? What was the process like, and what did you bring, each of you, to the sort of writing and editing process?
Do you want to go?
Complementary skills and personalities, I think, is the key.
Chalk and cheese.
Yeah.
No, we wrote an academic paper together about 15 years ago that had nothing to do with this book. And the genesis was that we realized, actually Nitin Noria, who was the previous dean of HBS, put us in touch and said, you guys are working on the same thing for the last 20 years. And I said, what's that? He says, well, what you're doing by comparing organizations in different contemporary developing countries, Jeff has been doing as a historian in the British Empire over time. But it's very similar sets of issues. So we put our heads together and said, that's a great observation. And we produced a scholarly paper that I think was quite impactful. So that's how we actually met in a scholarly sense at HBS. And then, as I said, I just got involved with the videos with Jeff, and it's kind of grown on its own and mushroomed. So it's good to see it happen. And it couldn't have happened without the incubation environment at HBS.
One last question. So business is often demonized in India. What myths do you think this book can actually dispel?
This is a very good question. There has been for the longest time two contrarian threads in Indian society. One is the efflorescence of entrepreneurship throughout centuries that I've been aware of as a reader. But there has also been a streak of several decades of anti-business sentiment. And it's not difficult to see where it comes from, because there's certainly cases, as there are in this country, of business misbehaving, taking advantage of others and so on. But I think in the main, that's not the story that I would tell about entrepreneurs. I would tell a much more positive story in India and in many of the other developing countries that we've encountered, where by and large, I like to believe in the goodness of men and women, and to say that by and large these are people who are trying to do something really interesting, something very, very difficult, something very ambitious, and something that should make us all very pleased and proud. So.
I'm often asked by students and others to point out the most responsible businesses I can think of, because they're very interested in going to work for such a business. And I repeatedly say to them, you've got to look at India. My short list of truly responsible businesses in the United States is very short. My list of such businesses I can point out in India is much longer, and it's gone on from generation to generation. And so, I mean, it is quite extraordinary that there's so much criticism of business in India. And yet I think that some of the Indian business houses are some of the most responsible over such a long period that I can see. And I've looked, across the emerging world as well as in the developed world.
So there's still a lot of videos left. What's next for the project?
Well, we wouldn't mind developing a book on Latin America. In that sense, the Indian book could be seen as a pilot, and we're so interested to see how people will react to it, criticisms, praise, whatever. We have rich material on Latin America and growing material on Africa too. So that's one direction I think we want to go.
Tarun, what do you hope people will take away from this book?
Just broaden their horizons. We all learn from analogy and comparison and experimentation, and rather than be limited to stories that have unfolded we're sitting in Boston right now in our immediate ambiance, the United States, and even more narrowly the East Coast. Why not learn from experiments all over the world, regardless of where you end up wanting to work? Because as any social scientist would tell you, you learn from variation. If you only study one thing, you don't learn very much because there's nothing to compare it to. You need to have a plethora of ways in which history has played out. And that's what I think people take away. I hope they enjoy the stories because they are incredibly inspiring. And I hope they broaden their sensibilities and worldview.